Wasn't it three? There was Maastricht, the original one, and then there was Maastricht, and there was enlargement, and there was a single European one as well.
There's no alternative to ratifying the Single European Act, and that's what I'm now saying.
I also remember the Single European Act just because there was a particularly witless poster, which seemed to be in every students' union in Ireland, which said, "Sell a field, sell a nation." And I thought that was fantastic because it meant absolutely nothing.
We've had a virtual library of new treaties. And as we have gone along, those people who've written the treaties, they understand what they mean. But they've left 99% of the citizens of Europe behind.
The Maastricht one obviously was the big one. As to what they all meant,
I bought myself a copy of the Maastricht Treaty. It was that thick, and it was impenetrable.
we had two Nice treaties, of course. One because we didn't really understand it, or so we were told.
If the Treaty of Nice is rejected in Ireland again, then I do not know how we can continue with enlargement.
I'm average intelligence, I'm very interested, but I hadn't got a clue.
We had the Seville Treaty, which I think was the one that actually fixed the Nice Treaty. I mean, they're so complicated.
Treaties and referenda on treaties have been an integral part of life in the European Union since we joined back in 1973. Another treaty is coming our way, and this one, they say, is going to be different. It's been drafted to accommodate a much larger European Union and will change how the EU operates in fundamental ways. It's different because it's a treaty which proposes a constitution for the EU. An EU that after May will have enlarged from 15 to 25 members. It merges all the previous treaties into one and is written in a style more accessible to EU citizens. The treaty was prepared by the Convention on the Future for Europe, and now its contentious elements are being hammered out by EU leaders.
There's no point in just going through the night and getting any old agreement.
I hate these arrangements where things start late. I mean, the one thing the Irish presidency will try and do is to try and get within at least 10 minutes of the starting time, not 3 hours.
A bid to conclude these negotiations during the Italian presidency failed late last year when the Poles and the Spaniards locked horns with the Germans and French in a row over voting powers. Commission President Romano Prodi has now warned that failure to reach agreement on this new treaty could result in some countries forging ahead while others are left behind, creating a two-speed Europe. There are usually a few more people in here, but this chamber is a regular feature on our television screens, mostly in news bulletins. That's because it's where the European Parliament meets here in Brussels. And for over 30 years, the European Union has become a regular feature in our lives. When Ireland joined the EEC in 1973, the country's economic, cultural and political focus was almost entirely on Britain.
If you think back to the years before Ireland was in the EU, if the Irish Taoiseach wanted to meet the British Prime Minister, he had to go over to London. There was never any question of a British Prime Minister coming here because they were the power and we were the supplicant. Since we've joined the European Union, the British need us because sometimes things that they want in Europe, the only way they'll get them is if the Irish and other small countries vote with them.
In the early days, a lot of people lost out, particularly in rural areas. A lot of small farmers went out of business in the new competitive markets. A lot of small companies went out of business.
I think those people were going to have to leave the land anyway. There had to be amalgamation of farms. And a lot of money has gone into developing the infrastructure around as well. We have decent factories, processing units and so on and so forth. Irish agriculture has done particularly well. In fact, no other sector has done better.
The one that was most important was the Single European Act because that was the one in effect that created the single market, that took down all the barriers and gave Ireland the kind of access that it never had before to trade.
As a driver then, you'd come up to, say, the border, any of the borders, and you'd face a queue of lorries that you could be there for 3 or 4 hours, and magically, overnight, throughout the whole of Europe, a whole lot of those queues disappeared, and I thought that was, I think it's an amazing act of getting rid of bureaucracy.
Anything that happened in Ireland, people just said, we should be able to get money from Europe to do that. There was serious addiction, and I thought at the time it was probably terminal, but what surprises me is how little you hear of it now.
The European Union may be viewed by some of us as just a large cash machine to be tapped into for every grant we need. And there's no denying we have availed of it for that purpose. But that is only part of the story of Ireland and the EU.
Everybody thinks, oh, how much money did we get? In actual fact, I regard benefits as a number of things, and one of them is that it forced us in this country to look at the legislation we had, to look at the political priorities we had. Now, when I was elected in '84, almost well over half the Irish MEPs of the 15 served on the Agricultural Committee. It was the only committee they were interested in. They weren't, for example, interested in environmental issues.
We in this country have a terrible track record on environmental protection, and practically all the good things that have happened in conservation and in environmental protection in this country have been because of the EU, and practically all the bad things that have happened have been despite the EU.
Our major environmental problems go back, many of them, to European Union policy. I'm talking about CAP, which is responsible for, more fertilizers, more sheep, all of these things which has caused environmental devastation. When you're talking in the area of transport, it's build more roads, which has caused an awful lot of environmental degradation and has increased CO2 emissions. So on the one hand, we have these directives, which I welcome, but it's very important that the EU, if it's to become truly sustainable, understands that we can't go down this road of just thinking economic growth.
It may sound extraordinary now, but as recently as 1973, many Irish women had to give up their jobs when they got married. We then joined the EEC, and the discrimination had to end. And since then, the EU has continued to strengthen the rights of its citizens.
In 1998, 2 Irish women won a landmark ruling in the European Court of Justice, which copper-fastened the rights of all job-sharing workers. The European courts and EU legislation have been a major influence on areas such as workers' rights, disability and equality rights.
In terms of travellers and the impact that the European Union would have had, I suppose the biggest impact it would have and the biggest influence would be in relation to the Equal Status Act. That certainly has been a huge positive move. It's certainly been a tool that travellers have been in a position to use in terms of asserting themselves, and other groups in society also. But certainly it's good to know that within the law we have a protection in terms of discrimination or racism.
The fact that the European Union plays a major part in our lives would seem to be beyond dispute. But we still elect our own national government and manage a lot of our own affairs, which begs the question, who is really in charge?
I don't think we know how much control it has over our lives. It depends on your policy. If you're a left-wing conspiracy maniac, you'll think that in fact it's running our life and it's going to send us out to a war in Macedonia in 2 years. If you're a right-wing conspiracy maniac, you think that it's going to make all our black puddings turn white.
The reality is that if you're to have a common market where people can move freely, where goods can move freely, where services can be sold from one country to another, you've got to have common rules. And if you've got common rules, you've got to have a common rule maker. And the common rule maker is the European Union.
In the late 70s, the EU introduced tachographs, what were then known as the spy in the cab. In a heavily industrialised society with a lot of trucks, they're absolutely imperative. But the problem in Ireland is we got none of the components that government were supposed to bring along. You have the M1 motorway where you have no stops, and yet the tachograph is telling you, and you will be prosecuted if the inspectors find that you've exceeded your driving time without taking your rest break, yet you're on the M1 motorway and you have to go off it into Drogheda or wherever to park your truck up. It was a question of European legislation that was appropriate to, say, Germany and France, the huge industrial areas, much less appropriate to our boreens and our present-day traffic jams.
I think it's important that we update our thinking and that we recognise that at the European level we confer certain powers to those institutions which are properly dealt with at that level. We also retain decisions at our own national level, for example, how we run our own health service, how we fund our health service, how we fund our education service, what priorities we want to give to social welfare. So I think we really need to recognise that we should incorporate more and more European Union issues into our domestic debate, because it's part of what we are now and it affects our domestic politics. It's not something that we do once a month, once every 2 months. It's here every day.
After the shock result of the first Nice referendum, the government responded to demands for greater transparency in our dealings with the EU. The National Forum on Europe facilitates public debate and discussion of EU issues, and members of the Oireachtas in committee can now scrutinise a range of draft EU legislation.
Brussels may seem like a long way away, but the EU provides a wealth of information on its activities through books, magazines and the internet. You can even come here to watch live press conferences from Brussels.
A different price on them according to where they're based.
But providing information and actually connecting with people are two very different things.
There is a huge problem with the EU, I think, in communications terms. They do not communicate their message properly.
A lot of the legislation is couched in legalese, in language that isn't readily understandable and also has gone through probably several layers of translation. And that has been a problem that has dogged journalists like myself who are trying to communicate and make it clear to other people. Remember subsidiarity? There were debates in the 90s, the early 90s, about subsidiarity. What did it mean?
In Britain, more people voted in the Big Brother vote than voted in the European elections. So Europe, for many people, is seen as over there. So there is still a consciousness there that Ireland is sort of 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Europe.
We're at ease with it in a broad sense, but we actually don't know that much about it. And that's not necessarily a healthy thing if we're all going to be asked to vote time and time again on an EU treaty or whatever.
Do you know the three main institutions of the European Union?
No. The EU Commission or something like that. Civics.
No, to be honest, no.
The Commission, the Parliament. I don't know what the third one is.
I don't know. It's Brussels and Strasbourg and much, and it's, to me, it's just Euro Disney.
I know that there are institutions in Brussels and Strasbourg, and they all have those headsets where they talk to each other in foreign languages.
It's so fragmented in terms of the different institutions that are actually there.
What exactly the reason, let's say, for the MEPs is, I wouldn't know.
They nearly all sound the same, the European Commission, the European Council and so forth.
What the difference between the Council of Ministers and the Commissioners, I wouldn't know either.
Ja, het is wel oneerlijk, oké, maar het is voor ons, what is substantive? And why should judges be left to make that decision?
The EU political model is unique, with its own system for developing policy and making laws. Business is run by an array of institutions, but at the centre are the big three: the Council, the Parliament and the Commission. The EU Commission is the engine of the European Union, headed up by commissioners nominated by each member country. Ireland's current commissioner, David Byrne, holds the Health and Consumer Protection portfolio. The Commission is the ideas centre of the EU. It's where policy is initiated and where legislation is drafted.
Their function is supranational. Now, that's a highfalutin word, but mainly what it means is that they devise policy which is for all beyond borders, not advancing sectional interests of one particular country.
Commissioners don't really represent their countries. They try to look after the European interest. There are very few votes in the Commission. There isn't much nationalist elbowing. Happens from time to time because we're only human. But by and large, the Commission does try to operate in the European interest.
The Commission makes the proposals, but it's the Council of Ministers that makes the decisions. The Council is made up of the ministers from each country coming together under the banner of their different portfolios. The ministers meet regularly at the Council's headquarters in Brussels, but on occasion they convene in the country that holds the EU presidency, which, at times, means getting really close to the people.
Several hundred Gardaí were on duty in Killarney, but they were powerless when the demonstrators crossed the fields to the hotel.
The most influential ministers and commissioners were here. Some of them were quite upset, and just it became a bit too intimate, shall we say.
When an important decision comes out, it's our minister sitting at the table who's taking responsibility for that. That's done in quite a closed way. Member states tend to concentrate very much on fighting for advantage against each other rather than thinking of the overall development.
Good morning, colleagues. The sitting is open.
And number 3 is the Parliament, which has 2 homes, one in Brussels and one in Strasbourg. Its current president is Corkman Pat Cox.
Permit me to say how much
In the past, some MEPs have been less than welcoming to visitors to the Parliament.
For the second time, Mr. Paisley.
The Parliament has gradually been acquiring more power. It now shares the power to pass legislation with the Council of Ministers, and crucially, it has the final say on the EU budget.
If there's a deadlock between what the Parliament wants and what the Council of Ministers want, it then goes to conciliation. And there, long, hard nights of extremely technical discussions go on. And hopefully at the end of it, we all then come to an agreement.
So those are the big 3 EU institutions, and that's how they've managed the EU up to now. But it has become clear through recent treaty votes and other issues that the EU and its institutions have been running into difficulties with the voters, and the EU is about to undergo the biggest enlargement in its history. So EU leaders recognise that significant change was needed, change in the way Europe governs itself. This would need a new treaty, and in the spirit of change, this treaty would be drafted and debated in a new and open way. In the past, EU treaties were negotiated behind closed doors in a process known as an intergovernmental conference. But after the controversial Nice Treaty, it was agreed that this would have to change. And so, in March 2002, the Convention on the Future of Europe was established. The convention, chaired by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, was made up of representatives of EU institutions, national governments and parliaments. And for the first time, varying shades of opinion across Europe, including opposition voices, were heard.
It has been a much more open process. And I think it will make it easier for people to sell the treaty when it is put to the people, to know that all parties in the Dáil have actually had an input, not just the government.
The fact that it was done in the open certainly is a good thing. I would have a certain reservation about the amount of democracy that was there because there were no actual votes on, amendments or anything like that. But it was an interesting experiment, and I think on the whole, you'd have to say, yes, it has been a good thing.
The convention was asked to draw up proposals on 3 main subjects: bringing citizens of the EU closer to its institutions, organising division of power in a growing European Union, and developing the role of the EU in the New World Order. The convention spent 18 months preparing a draft treaty, which was then presented to EU leaders. And that's where the recent row about voting rights comes in, as the leaders now debate its more contentious elements. Issue 1 is the proposal that in the European Council, more decisions will be taken using the system of qualified majority voting, where every member state has a share of the vote based on its population size. In the Nice Treaty, Spain and Poland won a disproportionate share of the vote relative to the size of their populations. Now the member states with the biggest populations, Germany and France, want to undo this deal.
You can argue till the cows come home as to what the mathematical benefits of one system are against the other. Frankly, that just bores the pants off most people. It's a much simpler system. But countries like Spain and Poland, they had a very valid argument against that, so we had to listen to them. And that's where the negotiations were going on there.
The issue of how many commissioners it will take to run an expanded EU is also controversial. The Convention has proposed a two-tier commission, where all states would have a commissioner, but only 15 would have voting rights at one time. This is not proving popular.
The proposal that's at present on the table is awful. The proposal is that the Commission should operate a bit like the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, that you have some voting members and some non-voting members, but still, whatever it is, 25 commissioners there. That is a recipe for more votes, for more divisiveness, for more nationalist sentiment in the Commission.
Today, for the first time in the history of the European Union, we approve a European security strategy.
The EU's developing defence policy is always a contentious issue for Ireland. This time, the proposed constitutional treaty includes a mutual defence clause, which means that in the event of an attack on an EU country, other EU countries could send in troops to defend it. However, Ireland can choose not to participate.
I don't think we can say to the other states, you can't do anything, that you can't engage in defence cooperation and collaboration. We really treat security and defence quite differently to many other small states in Europe. If we were Finland and our neighbours were Russia, then we would have quite a different view of security than we have. We're very, very protected here.
We are worried about the fact that you will now have this sort of two-speed Europe in relation to defence matters. But those countries that forge ahead, they'll be doing this under the auspices of the EU, under an EU banner, under an EU flag. And it is something that causes disquiet, especially among the neutral countries.
Other issues in the draft treaty which will be of particular interest to Ireland include a proposal to remove the national veto over some areas of tax policy and plans for closer cooperation on justice and asylum issues. The proposed new treaty also incorporates the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Our worry is that the discussions on the treaty haven't gone far enough. Firstly, we need to put social policy and the fight against poverty particularly right at the heart of the new constitution. Secondly, we argued that there needs to be a strong rights base to the European Union, and particularly the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which many governments, particularly our own and a couple of other governments, were very reluctant to see included in the treaty, should be included. And thirdly, there should be more democracy and openness and access to people in the treaty. In all of these areas, there has been progress. We would say not enough progress, but I can certainly say it's an improvement.
The convention was a hugely ambitious project, and I think it fulfilled its ambitions. We're now at the squabbling stage, and that'll probably go on for quite a while.
We don't know what the final product is. In terms of what we already have on the table, then it's a much clearer, simpler document than anything the EU has ever produced.
When the deal is done, the constitutional treaty will be put to a vote in at least 7 member states, including Ireland. Our referendum is expected to be held towards the end of 2005. So, once again, a debate on the future of Europe and our place within it is on the way.
People on the ground here can have an effect. We can have an effect by talking to our politicians about how they can influence the directions in the European Union. We can inform ourselves, we can learn about issues that really matter to us, rather than the issues which dominate the newspapers around the time of councils, which aren't always the issues that affect people's day-to-day lives.
I think what we've learned from the recent referenda too is, rather than polarised idea of vote yes for Europe, all is right, vote no for Europe, all is wrong. I mean, I think the people understand that neither of those propositions is correct. We need to take that sort of approach. It's what I call a Euro-realist approach. It's neither unquestioning in terms of the European project, because we need to robustly, obviously, examine and argue for our case and get a collective common position which makes sense to more and more of our citizens. But by the same token, we shouldn't take this, as I call, the sceptical approach, which is really, has no relevance to Ireland and flies in the face of all the benefits that European membership has brought to us.
Ireland has come a long way since we joined the EEC in 1973, and the European Union has changed fundamentally over the past 3 decades. We now have a unique opportunity to help shape the future of the EU as Ireland currently holds its presidency. During that time, the Taoiseach and fellow European leaders will look again at the prospect of reaching an agreement on the new constitutional treaty. And during the presidency, in May, 10 new countries will join the EU, a historic moment in the story of the European Union.
For further information, go to eu2004.ie.